This is Giovanni, my uncle. My Ecuadorian host uncle, that is. This past summer, I spent a month and a half living in the Ecuadorian Andes through the program Amigos de las Americas. There, I lived with Giovanni's family, and I had such an amazing experience. I not only learned so much about the Ecuadorian culture, I also really felt like I gained a new second family in Ecuador. Here's my host family. We have my host dad, Virgilio, my host sister, Luz, my host mom, Elena, and me in the very rainbow poncho. I learned while I was in Ecuador so much, but there was a sort of tenseness in the air because I heard that my host mom's brother, Giovanni, had recently left to go to the US. He had left just a couple of months before I arrived in Ecuador and was hoping to go get a job and be able to send money home to provide for his family and send his children to school. I happened to be reading a book called Enriques Journey by Sonia Nazario at the time, which made me incredibly worried for my host uncle. It recounts Enrique's journey from Honduras to North Carolina and tells the most horrific things that happened to him and other immigrants along the way, including encounters with bandits, rapists, and horrible incidents with moving trains. So I'm imagining Giovanni lying on the side of the train tracks in desperate need of help, and I'm trying not to worry any of my host family more than they already are. They had lost contact with Giovanni after he had reached Mexico, and they were unaware of where he was or how he was doing. Finally, we got a call from my mom's brother-in-law, who had been living in New York for quite some time. He had been in contact with Giovanni, and he told us that Giovanni had been detained and was in a jail in Texas. My host parents tried to help him as much as they could, but there really wasn't anything they could do, being so far away and being unable to contact him at all. Flash forward 2 months, and I'm back in the United States. I'm just starting to get readjusted to life in San Diego when I get a text from my host dad. Hola Megan, les cuento que estamos muy preocupados. Nos han notificado que Giovanni va a ser deportado muy pronto. Hay algo que ustedes pueden hacer. He told me that they were super worried about Giovanni. They had heard he was bound to be deported soon, and they wanted to know if there was anything that I could do to help. He was riddled in debt after making this long journey to the US, and they told me that he was in LA, and they wanted to know if I could help him. Thus began my search for him. I entered his information many times in the ICE detainee locator website until I finally found a match. It turns out he wasn't in Texas where they originally thought he was, and he wasn't in LA. He was in Irvine in the Orange County Jail, James A. Music Facility, just about a 12-minute drive from my grandma's house in Leisure World. So I told my host dad that I would go, pay him a visit, talk to him face to face, and let them know anything that I could. I was so nervous to be going to a jail. I had never visited a jail before. I had no idea what to expect. I guess that I was picturing the typical beefy thugs and sketchy psychopaths that you would see in the movies. But when I got there, I realized that was the complete opposite. I talked to the guards at the gate, and they were incredibly nice, but they didn't do much to ease my fears. They told me that they had seen some detainees stay for weeks, and they'd seen others stay for years. ICE generally waits to deport immigrants until they have enough to fill a full plane back to one specific country of origin. And since there aren't many Ecuadorians in the system, their guess was as good as mine as to how long Giovanni would have to wait. After going through security, I found out the only thing I was allowed to bring in the visiting room was my ID. I couldn't bring any of the photos that I had taken of his family and printed out to give to him, and I couldn't even bring in a pen and a notepad to jot down anything that he told us. That brought me, I went and waited with the visitors, and a shuttle brought me to the room where I first met Giovanni. I recognized him from across the room from the one photo that my host dad had sent me, and I saw him make his way to the table where my dad and I were waiting to greet him. All I wanted to do was reach over the protective wooden wall between us and shake his hand. A handshake was the typical greeting in Ecuador. Even the youngest children would walk down each and every pew at the Sunday services and shake everyone's hand, but I couldn't even do that. There was a sign right next to the table where I was sitting that said that my hands had to be placed on top of the table and there was no physical contact allowed between the inmates, detainees, and visitors. So I started by introducing myself, telling him who I was. After all, I was a complete stranger to him. I told him about my time with his family, about attending his brother's wedding and having his children over at my house for breakfast. And I told him that I wanted to help him in any way I could. In turn, he told me the story of how he had arrived in the US. He had paid a coyote, or a smuggler, $12,000 to get here, only to be deported just 30 minutes after crossing the border from Tijuana. He also told me that he had tried to get in contact with his family back in Ecuador, but a phone card for just 4 minutes would cost him $22. And $22, just to put in perspective, is about 4.5 quintales of peas. This here is a quintal, not even a quintal, maybe a third, that I had been picking for an hour and a half. So just imagine 4.5 of these at their weekly market for just 4 minutes on the phone. He didn't think that it would be good to pay for this and make himself even more in debt after he was already $12,000 in debt. He also told me during this first visit about his time at his court hearing, which had not turned out in his favor. He told me that although Angel, his brother-in-law, had tried to hire a lawyer, he hired a lawyer that lived in Texas because that was where they originally thought he was detained. And the lawyer had made no attempt to call Giovanni or be present at the hearing at all. So without any advice, he told the judge that his house had been destroyed in the most recent earthquake in Ecuador, which was far from the truth. The judge ruled that he would be deported as soon as ICE could fill the next plane to Ecuador. I told him that my family was here to help him in any way we could, and we talked a little bit more about how much we loved his family, the family that I had grown so fond of during my time through Amigos. When he talked about his family, his eyes welled up, and mine did too. As soon as I got to the car, I burst into tears. I wanted so badly to help him, to bring him home with me and help him find a job in Encinitas, start making back the money so that he could eventually send some home to his family. But I couldn't do that. I felt completely powerless. My dad and I spent weeks searching for a lawyer that could maybe help us, and after a while, we finally found a very nice lady that listened to his story for free, but unfortunately told us that there wasn't much hope for Giovanni. She said that because Ecuador is not in any state of political turmoil and there aren't any huge conflicts there as of now, there really wasn't much hope for him other than if he had possibly said that he is discriminated against because of his indigenous heritage. Even then, the judge is notorious here for granting almost no one asylum. So I told my host family the news, and of course they were devastated, but they were glad that he would at least be home soon, back with them, back with his family. I decided in the meantime to send him some books in Spanish to help him pass his days in the jail, and I decided to go visit him a second time to see how he was holding up. The second visit was what made incredibly clear to me that the people in these facilities are not the thugs and the psychopaths that we might think. They're families that have been torn apart because of our immigration system. Most of the visitors were wives and children or friends of the people in these jails. They weren't scary people at all. During my second visit, Giovanni told me about all of his worries for going back to Ecuador. He said that he really thought that when he got home, he would most likely have to move out of the community that he'd been raised in, where his whole family lives, in order to go to a bigger city and get a job. That pained me to hear. I couldn't imagine him leaving his tight-knit family. There wasn't a day that we didn't have cousins running through the house or aunts and uncles coming over for lunch or dinner. Giovanni also told me about his time in jail and what it was like. He said that he had 2 hours each day to play basketball outside with the new friends that he'd made. But mostly he spent his days reading the books that I had sent him and drawing with some paper that he'd picked up at the store at the jail. That got me thinking. I didn't understand how it could be better to keep these people detained and use federal funds to feed and guard them instead of letting them find a job in the US, rent a house, pay sales tax, and become an active member of society. Even if they sent money home to their family back in their native country, weren't they still contributing more to the US economy by working rather than being stuck in a detention center? I got a letter from Giovanni a few days after my second visit. What it said was both touching and inspiring. He told us that he was so thankful to have us as a second family here in the United States. And it reminded me a lot of how thankful I was to have his family as my second family in Ecuador. He also told us that he knew that when he got back to Ecuador, everything would work out because he was prepared to fight as hard as he had to provide for his family. As long as God gave him life and health, he knew that anything was possible. I was so amazed at how positive Giovanni stayed through this whole experience. Shortly after receiving this letter, I received a call from Giovanni. He told me that he had been moved to a detention center in Louisiana, and he knew that he was going to be sent back to Ecuador soon. That was the last time I heard from him. Next thing I knew, I got a text from my host dad that he was back in community, safe and sound. I was so relieved, and they were happy to have him back, although it would take him years to repay this monumental debt. Now, whenever I text my host family, they always tell me that they're doing well. Giovanni is too, and they're just luchando por la vida, fighting for life, fighting to continue to live happily in Etapa Santa Cruz. This experience taught me so much about not only the immigration and justice systems in the United States, but also about hope and faith. Giovanni thanked God again and again, even though he was stuck in a facility that charged him an insane price for a calling card in a country that didn't want him. He was so loyal to his Catholic faith, and he always had something nice to say. I also learned from this experience that I want to fight for social justice. I want to make sure that people like Giovanni are not taken advantage of in the same way. I want people to understand that immigrants like Giovanni are normal people in desperate situations. They're not dangerous criminals. The people that leave their families behind are making a horribly difficult decision. Try putting yourself in their shoes. Imagine staying home and watching your children grow up malnourished and uneducated, or making the decision to attempt the perilous journey to the United States in order to hopefully get a job and send money home to provide for your family. Neither option is remotely okay, but many families are facing this huge dilemma as we speak. It's important to remember this, especially these days. Immigrants like Giovanni are fueled by an intense desire to provide a better life for their family that no wall or fence can deter. I ask that you guys think of Giovanni and immigrants like him as normal people in desperate situations, not as simply statistics infiltrating our county jail. Because the truth is, Giovanni is not a dangerous criminal. He is a brother, a son, a husband, a father, and he is my uncle. Thank you.